called by the New York Times one of the great opera singers of tomorrow. He was singled out as truly charismatic international vocal personality with the potential of developing into a legend for our children. The fact that we are talking about a legend for our children indicates his youth, the fact that he sings at the Metropolitan Opera, or hopefully will soon be singing once again at the Metropolitan Opera as things get back together, makes him a person we have wanted to talk to for some time. Welcome, Neil Shicoff.
Thank you.
As a young man growing up in New York with a father who was a cantor, your reputation, as one reads your biography, was of a young upstart who thought he knew it all and was going to get into Juilliard by really forcing his way in, and had a tough time of it at the very beginning.
I wouldn't say it was a tough time. I think that I was pretty cocky, and I basically, when you're cocky, you're not all that sensitive to what's happening around you. And at Juilliard, I was a fighter. I thought I should be getting better things. I was really difficult. It was kind of an experience with Peter Menon, who's the president of the school, that slowed me down, knocked me down a peg. I remember going and auditioning for Manhattan School of Music and being offered two of the roles that were coming up in their, the two series of operas that they had. And I went back to Peter Menon and I said, here's what Manhattan has offered me, what do you have now?
That was Johnny Skeeky, I think.
Skeeky, yeah. And he indicated to me that I could easily go to Manhattan, but I certainly would never be allowed back into Juilliard, which was really something I wanted. I very much wanted to do a leading part in that school. I learned about patience in that situation. I was always raring to go. I very much wanted it all very quickly.
You had started singing at an extremely early age. I think it was 10 years old or something.
I used to sing at the end of a wedding ceremony, my father being a cantor. At the end of a wedding ceremony, there's a little boy comes down and sings his final prayer. And
then they step on the glass.
Then he steps on the glass. Or the flashbulb, as it were. Anyway, I was petrified to do that. Terribly nervous to get in front of 100 or 150 or 200. I remember always saying to my father, how many people are exactly out there? I mean, exactly. It was a matter of, there were 10 more. I was, that much more nervous. Well, the final job of that young career was when I sang in the Essex House at Central Park South. And I thought I heard somebody laugh in the audience. And that was the end. I gave up that career completely. And very much wanted to be an attorney at the time.
Did your you wanted to be an attorney, which is what it says here, and were your parents saying, you've got a great voice, you should really be an opera singer?
My father was, that's an interesting question. He was a bit distant at first, so as not to push me into anything. Whatever I chose was the important thing. He was very supportive once I made the decision to at least take lessons with him, which I thought was interesting. I used to sing with the record player upstairs, which was not a stereo in those days. And it was Jan Pierce singing The Bluebird of Happiness. So I used to scream and literally scream. There was no voice. I was 14 or something. 14 and a half, I think. And my father insisted that any chance of singing, if I continued to do what I was doing, was out of the question. I would be a goner,
Right.
There'd be no voice there. So he decided to teach me once a week, as long as I didn't really shout and scream in upstairs singing, and also at ball games. I remember I used to be at that time I was a Met fan, and I used to go because it was close. We lived in Long Beach, Long Island, and Queens didn't seem that far. I know, the Bronx was a bit further.
That's my home.
That's why I bring it up.
Thank you. The classical repertoire.
Wait a minute, wasn't I talking about
You were
something?
talking about screaming to Jan Pierce,
Jan Pierce.
Bluebird of Happiness.
Okay.
I wanted to know how the classical repertoire entered your consciousness.
Very slowly, I might say. What I did, just to give you a little idea of what occurred, I then, after high school, went to cantorial school for 3 years, then went to Juilliard. now to answer your question, is at Juilliard I studied my first year with Jenny Turrell, who was on the vocal faculty. This was a woman of incredible knowledge of the French literature. I was only interested in the theory of how to sing loud and louder. I look at that period actually in regret because I didn't take advantage of her knowledge.
Her lyricism.
Sure. I mean, now as I sing a French role, to think that I worked with a woman who was so good in that field and never sang a French song with her, never sang anything except Caro Mio Ben every week until she'd say, "Do you have anything else? Can you learn anything else?" And I said, "Well, come on, let me go on to something bigger, But I didn't want to learn anything. I just wanted to sing high notes, basically. I was a brash, dumb kid, at the time, really. It was just noise and sound, and it took
Well, there is this theory of the Helden tenor. The theory that in order to be able to sing certain kinds of roles that project enormous strength for extended periods of time, especially in the Wagnerian mold, that you must take a young person and begin to mold that person as soon as his voice changes, just about, into a Helden tenor. And it sounds to me, and this is out of left field, but that you were sort of doing that to yourself at an early age. I mean, Menin's telling you that you were going to injure your voice if you kept up this kind of treatment of yourself, is exactly the kind of thing that we hear young tenors in Europe having gone through in order to develop them into a certain kind of
I was not aware of that. That's interesting. I did not know that in terms of Helden tenors. My voice will never be, no matter how much. I could scream from today, even when it's hoarse and I have a cold and I wake up in the morning, I can't even think I'm a Helden tenor. But I did always think that if I sang a little bit on the bigger side, my voice would grow. I did believe that. It took people well, let me go back to one thing. When I went to Santa Fe, which was an apprentice program that it's an opera summer festival, and they have an apprentice program. It's one of the very, very good ones in the United States. I went there and met a lot of people who then introduced me to ideas that there's a certain amount of technique involved in a career, not only in singing, but there's a path to follow. Slowly, you stay in the lyric repertoire. If your voice grows, you move into a heavier repertoire, maybe into a spinto repertoire. And onward, it depends on where you begin and where your aspirations take you. I basically, even today, still believe that you can mentally mold your voice into a certain place. My opinion on this subject is that, for instance, Placido Domingo, who sang a very, very wonderful and successful Otello to open the season last time, when there was a season last year, when he began and sang all those lyric arias, one might not have thought that he could accomplish that goal. And I basically think it was that the idea, the mental
set,
that enabled him to reach a goal that is phenomenal for him. And
he actually said exactly that on this program.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I believe the same thing. I think that there are roles that I very much want to do, and if, for instance, now I'm doing the French repertoire a great deal, as well as lyrical Italian roles. That doesn't mean that for the rest of my career that's where I want to stay. I think it's very healthy to stay there now, but that I have to use that. I see you're moving paper.
I'm moving paper only because I didn't mean to distract you, but you've mentioned at some point the Met entered, and I wanted to get you to recount the story of joining the Met because it is such an astounding story relating to the availability of a role, and you're being heard by James Levine.
What does that say that in front of you?
Wait a minute. It did. That's what I was.
Lies. These are lies. These things are made up of lies. You can't go by the things in front of you. Okay, I know what you mean. I think that you mean basically what happened in 1975. I filled in for Richard Tucker, who had just
That's it.
passed away, and he was scheduled to do the Hernani, the title role in the May Festival in Cincinnati, and James Levine was the conductor. I auditioned for Levine with, it was my present manager, Matthew Epstein, who suggested that I sing for Jimmy, and see what happened. It was Levine who then said, you know, there's this role that I have coming up. Even though I think you're a lyric tenor now and don't go into heavy roles, there's this role, which is a very heavy role, I'd like to listen, you know, to you for. To really be serious about that, it was one night. It was a concert version. There was a great deal of coaching with Levine, and it's not the kind of thing that can really damage a voice. And I did at that performance a credible job, good and bad. There were absolute problems because I was in 1975. I don't know how old I was. I was born in 1949, so I was in my mid-20s somewhere. 26 or 5 or something. So I was very young, and I was put into a situation with stars. Cornell McNeil was the baritone, Clarice Carson, Bonaldo Giotti, and Levine. And I was a kid. So the things were good and bad. That's exactly what the review said, and frankly, they were right. I mean, I have my own feeling about reviews, but in that particular situation, they were right. From there, I didn't hear anything from Levine regarding any other jobs until about a year later, or 10 months later, I think, when he asked for me to audition for the Metropolitan, at which point I did on 2 separate occasions, on stage. And I remember having a lunch with him one day, probably after the second audition, when he asked me what I would like to debut in, and I said, well, I'd like to actually debut in Faust. And he said, well, that's what you'd like to do, but how about Johnny Schicchi? It was very funny. And I just come off of one of my, I had done an American series in Houston, in Faust, and I felt, sure, I can do that to the Metropolitan. Somewhat holding over those Juilliard, you know, that I can do it. So he put me in a Johnny Schicchi, and it was a lot of luck basically in the Metropolitan. I was not scheduled in the second year to do a Rigoletto. It was only that a tenor, Veriano Lucchetti, was scheduled to do it, and I filled in for him.
Let me quote the New York Times. There's no date on this, so I don't know at what point in your career this was given. But of our guest today, Neil Shicoff, the New York Times said, "Good tenors, especially young and handsome ones, are a rare breed. And judging from the important roles he's been given, Neil Shicoff's mentors at the Met are aware that they may be in possession of the best new talent in many a season." That kind of notice is what people are willing to sell parts of their body for.
That was written by my mother. Come on, she just typed it in there.
She looks great, though, the way she writes it. That's fantastic. And at the...
I'll tell you something. Wait a minute. One always thinks that it's really wonderful on the air for somebody to read a review. That's fantastic. But I've gotten, honestly, in a career, let's say hypothetically, 100 reviews. I mean, I don't know where it stands. Let's say 100 reviews. I'd say 60 or 70 of them were terrible.
But you're a very young man, and to get even some good reviews
is
a wonderful thing to have amassed.
A story about that. Not to mention the critic, because I don't want to make him famous. When I filled in again at the Metropolitan in my second season for a tenor, this time we won't name him, in La Boheme, I filled in on very short notice, and the next day the New York Times absolutely destroyed me. They ruined. I mean, this happens to be one of the good quotes. That one was a really bad one, and it was then that I took that review and I went to James Levine and I said, Jimmy, look at this review. And he said, well, I'll tell you my feeling about this. And he went down the list. He said, I want you to know that last year this tenor and this tenor, all the famous tenors had, they had all come to him with various reviews that had not gone well, and they'd spoken about it. Or they felt one way or the other. He said to me that if you take a review, and if you get a really good review, and you take it in your heart, and and you're willing to sell your soul for that good review, the next time you get a bad review, it's really going to hurt, because you've got to believe it if you believe the good ones. Now, my feeling about this is if you have a given job and you get 2, 3 reviews, and there's a slice of something that goes through those 3 reviews, that you should look out for. But as to take an entire review on tour, when I did Rigoletto, I think it was, second or third year at the Met, 2 reviews came out in each city. And I swear to you that each review was exactly the opposite of the other one. One review would be very good and one review would be very bad. Now, you just have to look at it and say, well, you know, somebody out there, those people were not at the same shows, you know. So, I mean, basically, it's a feeling that, you know, of course you like to get good reviews, and you're really within an opening in a theater in a city you haven't been in. They're important. They are important. We like to think they're not, but they are important. And you get to know reviewers that you respect. There are good reviewers as well as bad ones, and you get to know the ones that are good, and you listen to them to a certain extent. You like to know that their ears are out there and what they say.
We are talking today on Metropolitan Arts with Neil Shicoff, a young tenor in his very early 30s who has amassed an enormous amount of critical acclaim and some brickbats as well. But we've been quoting the good ones here today. He sings with the Metropolitan Opera and all over the world at festivals. I mentioned, I think, before the festival at Aix-en-Provence, the Staatsopera in Berlin.
No,
in
Munich.
Munich, sorry.
It's all right.
And all over Europe as well. Are we living in an era when the tenor is newly appreciated? For a long time, people said opera singers are not as good as they once were. And there are still people, as you know, who sing that particular plaint. But there seems to be on the horizon, in addition to people like Pavarotti and people of that age, younger people like yourself with enormous strengths who are getting terrific reviews. People saying that this is going to be the new breed of excitement in the opera house. Is there a new breed of excitement in the opera house?
Oh, I think there definitely is. I think, first of all, there's a new breed of American singers that are and will move on to the international circuit. We are basically better musicians than we were years ago because of the school situations, and we are encouraged to go to universities or conservatories, and we're taught to look the part. If we can remain slender, to remain slender.
I know you jog.
Yeah, I work out for that reason, and I do a lot of push-ups now because it's turned a little cold, and I prefer to. I do. However, I don't do those to another tenor. I do that to Donna Summer and a disco album that I. But let me really remain serious on this issue. Also, there's a whole sense of acting. There's a whole sense of drama for the American singer now to incorporate drama and music. I think that Beverly Sills, for instance, who became really very prominent, besides through her voice, which is a glorious instrument, through television and radio, and her personality. And she's from what I know and gather, she's a tremendous proponent of the idea of American singers doing theater. And that's partially, or maybe, what her house is made up of, which is wonderful. Now, when we get on an international level, sing throughout Europe and in the prominent houses in the United States, we are a little bit different than the Europeans, I think. Maybe I'm being,
Chauvinistic.
Chauvinistic, okay, for men and women. But I think that there's a difference.
Because of acting, because of being
there's
able to get into
there's
a
really
role.
a total commitment to it. There's a feeling that you really want the public to have an experience that night, not only through the voice.
Now, many years ago, someone once wrote an article in our magazine Keynote, and I wrote a letter responding to it because I am a proponent of what you are now talking about, which is acting in opera. And yet I can see that many years ago, artists would stop all the action in an opera, do fantastic feats of vocal daring with either no orchestral accompaniment, or if it was the second or third time this had happened, with orchestral accompaniment, and bring the house down, and there would be headlines the next day.
Right.
The fact that the story at that point was completely stopped, that there was usually the person at that point was out of character, and that everyone else on the stage was just standing there watching this go on, meant absolutely nothing. That was for a certain type of audience in a certain era. Are we at a point now where the audiences for opera are changing so that you can achieve more by being true to a role than you can by that
Good
vocal
question.
daring do?
Good question. You know, in Europe, for instance, at the end of an aria in certain of the major houses, you take a bow. I don't, because I feel very uncomfortable doing that. But the European singers, some of the European singers do. So there's an absolute stop. It still is not an era that's past and gone forever. In America, I basically think the difference is that we have a lot of regional houses that do things in English. And the audience gets used to, if a singer has good diction, to understand what's going on.
Really following the story.
Yes. I'm a believer in that, certainly for certain roles. Even on an international level, certain roles, maybe. Well, on a major houses in the United States and an international level, I mean. But basically, that has a lot to do with it. You have a house, for instance, one of the theaters that I really began in, which was the Houston Grand Opera, has an international series and an American series. And the international is in the original language, whatever that may be, of the opera, and the American is in English. And those English series are filled up. It's not something that, you have half a theater or a quarter of a theater. They're sold out. And many of the other smaller theaters, Detroit in Michigan, Detroit Opera has does a lot of things in English. So that the audience gets accustomed to really understanding it and wanting to see something other than a voice. I will say something, which is my opinion about this. We as American singers have to be really careful that even though we can reach a public through acting, that we have to know how to sing. It's a real tendency for a lot of us to have an American sound, which is not really that old, if you're singing an Italian opera, that old Italian sound. I feel that there's a lot of that of American singers, that they don't sound Italianate. They don't sound whatever. They don't have that sound. It's a whiter kind of a sound that Americans tend to have. I think that's a real danger. I specifically asked my manager to book me a great deal in Europe so that I could see that whole flavor of the European houses. I sing a great deal in Germany. In December 20th, I make my debut in Italy, in Florence, to open the season. Where else? In Covent Garden, in London, all over the place. In Paris, I debut in 2 years. So that I try to divide, actually in the next 2 years, to be truthful about it. Most of my work is in Europe right now, and very little in America, and what is here is either in Houston or the Metropolitan. So as I can get accustomed to working with those kind of singers. Yes, they're at the Metropolitan. Yes, we have great singers here.
The tradition in Europe is a very different tradition in terms of seats being passed down from father to son, of just that whole tradition of going to the opera. Is there development of any kind of audiences going on in the United States? Do your peers, your friends, go to the opera or think of going to the opera if they're in their early 30s, or are they more likely to listen to Donna Summer? And how do you begin to introduce people to the complex art that opera is, that can be a very satisfying one once you know what it is you're supposed to be listening to? They are, many of them, written 100 years ago, and it's not as easy as listening to a 3-minute ditty on your local rock station.
I find, well, that's a difficult question. Some of the friends that I have who are not involved with music at all, which I like to have as friends, because you're not so narrow about life in general. Yes, I do try to, when I sing, I try to give them tickets, or if they ask me to try to get them tickets either free or easy. It's easier for me to get for some of the people I know, even though I always claim it's not. In certain situations, it is.
Now everyone knows when to write, Neil.
It's only on rare occasions. I do try to get people involved, absolutely. It's interesting to me because opera can really move people. It is a total art between music and theater. Yes, things are a little old-fashioned on the stage, but the feelings, the gut level things are there to be felt. I always have felt that inside myself that basically opera is, for some singers, for myself, is a little bit like being a rock singer. There's this enormous sexual drive and these vibrations that go out on these rock singers that certainly the younger generation absolutely feels. I feel that there's no question that I mean, it can be construed in many, many ways, but I do feel a sexual feeling from actually singing. And I like to give that feeling over to the public. I know that there were certain singers when I was younger and stood online and stood as a standee at the Met and saw these singers and was, I mean, aroused isn't really quite the word, but, you know, aroused emotionally from these, and feel an incredible
Move.
surge.
You're
Yeah,
moved.
absolutely. But on a real level of a kind of a sexual level in a way. Not because it's a man or a woman or any of that stuff. I'm not talking about that. And as a singer, absolutely feel that. I absolutely feel a sexual drive about it. It's a real high, and I really want the audience to kind of feel that. I have, as a young singer, felt sometimes a wall has been up between me and the public, and that's my fault. Levine has commented on that with me. Many times I'll sing, and because of a fear of facing 3,000, 4,000 people, you tend to put a wall up. As a performer, I tend to do that. And it's taken experience, which is not completely, I have not overcome that, but I have overcome it to a certain extent where that wall breaks. And you really can reach out and feel a public, and you can communicate. It happens not a lot. I mean, maybe there's performers who will absolutely say it happens a lot. I don't believe that. I think that it's rare when that happens, but it becomes more and more. And the more you can keep down that wall, the more it's going to happen. And that's what keeps me in the profession. It's one of the reasons that keeps me singing, is that it's the world stops. It's a moment of communication with a mass of people, and you know that they're feeling what you're feeling, and it's a very, very special moment.
You've accomplished an awful lot in the last couple of years for a young guy, and you're talking about your Italian debut, going back to Covent Garden, going to make your debut in France over the next couple of years. Is this part of a long plan? Do you see yourself moving into certain areas, certain roles that you are not willing to take on now that you would like to take on in 4 or 5 or 6 years?
Well, there's been, you know, as a singer, and you're always offered, if you become successful, they're always offering you things that they'd like you to do. Usually they're a little heavier than you'd like. I've turned down, for instance, a Louisa Miller, which was offered to me in Zurich. I can mention it because I do go to Zurich this March to sing Werther, so it's not a house I don't sing it. But other roles, Manon Lescaut I was offered, which would be deadly. I would be ruined and killed if I did something, I believe. I mean, maybe I could get away with it, but you know what happens? It's like a snowball. You do a role that's too heavy for you or a little bit heavy for you. People like it. You do it well once, and then the offers start coming in. At 31 now, it's a mistake for me to start moving into repertoire that's too heavy for me. You've got to be smarter than that. One has to learn to say no. And the question that I thought you were going to ask, which is an interesting question, is not so much the roles, which I can give, you know, my standard rhetoric answer, which is the truth, but I mean, that's not so interesting as, now that my career has moved towards Europe, where does it take me emotionally? Here I am, a New York boy, singing in
Married with a new house on in New York.
An apartment on Central Park West, absolutely. But now all of a sudden, I'm put in, mainly because of my own doing and my manager's encouragement. We both thought this out very strongly. All of a sudden, I'm singing now, in the next 2 years, I could be in New York, 4 months, that's all. It's an emotional break from the Metropolitan, from New York, from friends, from family. It's very difficult. It makes you really feel. For instance, all of the dues that I never felt that I paid in the beginning, because boy, I made it fast. My professional debut was. Let's go back even one step. In 1974, I was singing La Boheme at Juilliard. In 75, in May, I was singing with Levine in the May Festival. In 76, I debuted at the Met. So we're talking about a person who took off, skyrocketed really fast to a certain echelon, to a certain plateau. Now comes the dues. Now comes, you got to work for it, kid. You got to go from city to city. You've got to feel lonely in these cities. You know, you've got to try to create something. You've got to grow. It's hard now.
You, I know, will adjust well because you are a talented young man, and because I know you really want to do it. And it is because of people like you that opera remains the moving and exciting experience that it is.
I
And
hope
we're
so.
fortunate to have
Thank you.
young people like Neil Shicoff devoting their lives to this art. And I thank you for this past half hour, which was a very enjoyable one for
My
me.
pleasure. Thank you.
We look forward to Neil Shicoff singing at the Metropolitan Opera this season when it gets underway, and for the times that he is able to return. And I know you will be back in a couple of years with more of these wonderful reviews that we can quote and hopefully talk to you again. It's been a pleasure speaking with tenor Neil Shicoff today. And you've been listening to Metropolitan Arts.